everybody. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, great. Thank you very much for having me here today. Certainly do appreciate it. Without the audience, we don't have readers, and without readers, I don't have anything to write about. So it certainly is a pleasure to meet all of you again. And a lot of you I'm seeing for a second time. We saw you last year when I was at the other campus. We had a great group, and it was entertaining, and Sue's right. It did go on with questions and answers for a couple of hours. But I always try to wrap things up within 1 hour, so I do have an agenda that I do try to follow at least. So I wanted to certainly thank Sue for the warm introduction and all of her support. Earl's back there. Thank you very much, and a special thank you to Amanda Warren too. Amanda contacted me several months ago and asked me to speak today, and I agreed to it, and I guess Amanda's not here today, so unfortunately she might have to watch us on TV. So it's a great show to watch if you want to go to sleep, so you know. And I also want to thank Brian Blackton. Brian Blackton is with the Around Town Concord, New Hampshire, Channel 22. So if you folks want to view this, it's something new that we're doing. I've been giving some talks and some lectures, and certainly doing an awful lot of writing. It's a lot of fun. I really enjoy it, but Brian came through and said, why not put it on the local TV station? So thank you, Brian, very much. So if you all wave to Brian, you're going to be on TV. Channel 22, folks, there we go. Thank you very much. Okay, did my voice just increase here? Are we doing good?
I turned you up a wee bit.
Okay, good. That sounds good. Appreciate it. What I do, a little bit about my background, my bio, born and raised, native of New Hampshire, local family, grew up in Concord. My family's been in Concord since 1850. We're an old Concord family. I love history, I love poetry, and I like prose. I do a lot of writing. I grew up with probably a lot of your children here. I know Ruby Bartlett's son and I are best friends growing up, fellow Boy Scouts, and I do know a lot of the people in the local community. A few years ago, I was writing on the computer a blog. Basically, there's a history Facebook page, which some of you might have access to, you might not. But I started writing, and I was contacted by the newspaper, and they just said, you know, if you can commit to doing a weekly column, that they certainly would be interested. So I was very interested in doing that, and I just wrote, I believe, Vintage Views number 79. So that's 79 weeks in running. So it's been, thank you, it's been good. Thank you. People have said to me, what are you going to do when you run out of stories? But I don't see any hope of that. And that's probably because I'm 70% Irish. I don't know, but I have plenty of stories, there's no doubt. So I do Vintage Views. I've also recently started getting published in the Concord Insider for my poetry. My poetry, like my writing, is inspired certainly by family, and also by the beautiful surroundings that we live in here in New Hampshire. But really, most importantly, too, is history. I write a lot of history in my Vintage Views columns. That's what it's all about. And I also do that in my poetry. So sometimes it's nice to get a message across just in a very, very short stanza or a short poem. So I've been doing that too. In some of the other areas that I'm published on is some of the local, Local, Channel 9, and some of the other Facebook pages too. So it's very enjoyable. I'm having a lot of fun with that. I'm in a couple of other books printed by Prolific Press, and there's an anthology I'm published in, and also a book called 3-Line Poetry too. So people tend to listen, people tend to like it, and I'm fortunate to be able to share that story. When I was younger, I had a history teacher at Concord High School, and my teacher said to me, "This is history." It was rather dry, it was rather boring, and I wasn't really paying attention. I was staring out the window at the round track in front of Concord High School. And he said something to me, that my history teacher, that really did stick in my mind, because history can be boring, and a lot of younger people tend not to enjoy it as much as perhaps we do. So he said to me, he says, "It's been said by a notable author who I won't quote because I can't remember accurately. But it's been said that if you put history in the form of a story, people actually retain it, and they remember it. And it becomes a lesson in itself, but you actually remember it. So when I set out to establish my Vintage Views column, I found the happy medium, a certain amount of words, 800 to 1,000 words in the Concord Monitor each Sunday. And I set out so that, I call it blue-collar history. It applies to everybody. I can go up to the landfill with some recycled items on a Saturday and talk to the young fellow up there, and he says, "Hey, I saw your column, I love it. I really enjoy it." And then I'm down on Main Street buying something to eat or getting a coffee, and a former Superior Court judge comes by and says, "Hey, I love your column. I really enjoy it." And when that all came together for me, it really touched me, because I had set out to make this a blue-collar type of history, easy to read, and certainly in storybook form, easy to remember. So that was my objective going into this. My background getting into this, after high school I went to college, numbers guy, worked for a very big corporation, retired from that corporation, and started writing again several years ago. The interesting thing is, as a young child growing up in Concord back in the 1960s, I actually went to St. Peter's School. It's on Bradley Street. It's behind the Old North Cemetery, which is up by Walker School across the street. So here I am, I'm 6, 7 years old. Didn't know much about the family history, always had a keen interest, but for some reason, I loved to gravitate to the back of that upstairs room and look out at that cemetery. I just thought that was the coolest thing. You're looking at history, but I don't know what it was. I always felt that draw. I always felt that I wanted to stare out there. I wanted to walk through the cemetery. I really felt connected in some way. Hence the beginning of my love of history. So fast forward a number of years after I retired from the big company. I'm back in Concord. I decided to stop writing again. I also decided that I wanted to volunteer more. I'm very involved in Rotary around Concord, and I'm also on the City of Concord Heritage Commission. I try to save buildings that might be considered to be demolished, and just try to do my point and help everyone out. So I turned around and started volunteering there. Also started volunteering at the State Hospital. There was a nice group over there that wanted to preserve the cemetery over on Clinton Street. Meadow 1 and Meadow 2, they call it. And I spent a lot of time over there with the Reverend and the chaplain, Ed Costa. Wonderful group of people. We were able to tap some of the age-old trust funds dating back 100 years to preserve a lot of those stones. Once I started researching, which is what writers do, they research. Once I started researching, I started discovering something. And it pained me. It really pained me because it bothered me. It was tearing at me. And what that was is, there's a lot of people that passed away over the years, dating back to the 1850s when the State Hospital was formed during that era. And they would die and they'd be buried. And that would be it. No stone, no service, nothing. There was no recognition. And that really was a very, very sad thing for me to hear. And it certainly bothered me. So I set out through my research and started doing some things with the entire team at the New Hampshire Hospital over the past 4 or 5 years. And what I did was, through that research, I documented a few things. I found out that there's people actually on the grounds of the New Hampshire Hospital. I started reading old volumes. I read late into the night, and I read books that are 100 years old routinely, online or at the library, Historical Society, or the State Library. And I found this one, just a short paragraph, and it said, these souls were committed to hallowed ground 100 yards west of the coal bunker on the State Hospital grounds. And I started thinking, And I have some friends that have a lot of knowledge of the State Hospital, and I said, where was the coal bunker? And they told me. And we got a tape measure. My good friend Mike Dunn, actually, he's a local businessman. And Mike and I were on the committee together. We ran it out 100 yards, and wouldn't you know, there was a pond on the grounds of the state hospital. On the edge of that pond, on a little knoll, that's where that landed. So I said, well, I can't let this go. This is really tearing at me. So I ended up doing some more research, and I have a friend up at Dartmouth College that has an interesting life. He maps crevices at the polar ice cap with ground-penetrating radar. Doesn't everybody know people that do ground-penetrating radar? So I ended up contacting Steve, and he came down from Dartmouth, and we ran a ground-penetrating radar over in that area. And sure enough, there's 22 anomalies. So we found that there were 22 people buried there. Never known. Turned around and contacted the New Hampshire State archaeologist, who became a good friend of mine too a few years back. And Dick Bovair was his name. He's now retired. So Dick and I went over there, and he examined it, and he goes, you know what, you're right. You found a burial ground. We didn't know about this. So you've got 22 people that were more than likely wrapped in canvas and just rolled into a grave not too deep. And that's sad. What a sad ending to a life. So that bothered me. So we tapped a trust fund, and we got great support from the state of New Hampshire. And they put up granite post around it, stainless steel, chain link fencing. And because I'm a writer, they said, could you write a little verse? So I did that. I wrote a little verse, and I go over there every Memorial Day, and I decorate that with a flag. Because you know those people in that time period, they were good people just like us, no different. And a lot of people that were buried during that era are in fact Civil War veterans too. So we don't know if they're veterans or not. We don't have their names. I just know there's 22 souls buried there. So that was very touching. But after that happened, I got the bug. I said, well, there must be more. So I went over to the Oak Grove, and we did more ground-penetrating radar. And the hunt continued. We didn't really find anything else on the grounds, but we did at the Blossom Hill Cemetery. I started working on research with Jill McDaniel up at the hospital, up at the cemetery, on the hospital patients. And we found 70 burials, unknown burials of patients up there, dating back. We also found a big stone. And on this stone, it's in the back of the Blossom Hill Cemetery up towards the north. It had all these names. It didn't say anything. And I said, what's that stone? Well, I don't know. So we got looking, and that stone was put up probably around 1970. I said, those are all patients. Well, why aren't we recognizing them as patients of the New Hampshire hospital? Everyone looked at me and said, I don't know. So I made sure we got a nice big brass seal, State of New Hampshire, and that went on the front. And it was the work of many people, wonderful people in this committee that I was honored to serve on, that we worked on this. We found out too we were missing some names. So we added those names. And then I was honored to write a poem that was inscribed there. We went over to Clinton Street, and then we found that there was a lot of damaged stones, missing stones. There was some work that needed to be done. If any of you drove out Clinton Street several years ago, there was a white cross on the north side, and people would see that white wooden cross, and they'd say, what is that cross? Nobody really knew what it was. Well, all the stones are flat. You didn't know. There's hundreds of patients that were buried there. After they were buried in the unknown grave on the grounds, they went up to the Blossom Hill Cemetery, and they buried them there. And then in the 70s, you know, they buried more people in a big marked corner lot that I mentioned. And they had this beautiful, beautiful cemetery called Meadow Cemetery. You got Meadow North and Meadow South. So what we did is we, again, utilized some of the funding from the state hospital. And when we got that funding, we put up 2 nice granite. We took the white cross down, we put up 2 nice granite monuments. And I did write a free verse poem for each to honor the people that buried there. We had a little ceremony. And then we put some signs up by the road too. So we're surrounded by history here in Concord, everywhere you go. I mean, if I could walk around this room and talk to each of you, I'm sure each of you could tell me a story. And that's the fascinating thing. We all have a story. And it's great to capture that story and retell that story and preserve that story for the next generation. And that's what I do at Vintage Views. I try to save those stories so that perhaps somebody reads them next week, or maybe somebody 100 years from now that's like me is doing some research, and they'll find that story. And they'll say, that's great. I didn't know about that. So that's kind of interesting. The way that I got that bug, again, I'm a little guy, I'm over at St. Peter's School, I'm looking out the window of the cemetery nonstop. I talked to my dad, and Dad was a great guy. He was a retired New Hampshire state trooper, and he died when I was quite young. But before he died, he used to tell me stories all the time. And I would remember a lot of the stories. And, you know, my great-grandfather owned a quarry. He owned Spain quarries up past Perry's. And then I remember another story about my grandfather working for B&M Railroad. A lot of interesting stories. And I remember, again, most of those stories that he told me. It was always a mystery, though, because everybody died so young back then. It was always a mystery. I'd say, you know, I never knew my grandfather, and everyone had passed away. So I ended up doing research on my family. And it was quite interesting. I found out that my family arrived here in Concord in 1850. There was 4 brothers. And I spoke about this in the genealogy class that we had last time I was here, but I'm going to just tell it briefly, real quickly. So the potato famine was raging in the mid-1800s in Ireland. And there's 4 brothers, the Spain brothers, James, my namesake, Thomas, Michael, and Martin, who's actually my great-great-grandfather. They left. They were tenant farmers in Ireland, and they were going poor. I mean, there's no food, there's no place to live. A tenant farmer basically rents that land year to year, and when you produce your crops, you sell your crops so that you can pay for the next year. And sometimes you fall behind, and when this happens repeatedly, as it did during the potato famine in Ireland in the mid-1800s, people lost their farms. They were told they had to leave. So we had a huge, huge migration to America, as you all know. That's no secret. Well, my branch of the family was 4 brothers. They came over, and they committed to work in the mills of Manchester for a period of time, a year or 2, so they could pay for the person that forwarded the funds to ship them over here. Once they had done their time at the mills of Manchester, they decided to head north to Concord. So they arrived in Concord, it was about 1850, and they had strong ties back to Ireland, so each and every one of them married a woman from Ireland. And when I'm doing my family research, it's fascinating because the names are just beautiful. Mary Ellen Cooley, Bridget Madden, wonderful old Irish names. So, love the history, love the story, and that's how we ended up in Concord. So, they lived here, they worked in the quarries, they labored very, very hard, and they were just good, solid people. I find inspiration, I write about them quite frequently. In Vintage Views, I just wrote about the Kentucket Island Park that is in Pennacook. It was in the Sunday Monitor a few weeks ago, and I had a picture of Stephen Spain, who's, I believe, a great-great-uncle of mine. And he worked for the Concord horse trolley. Not the electric trolley, but the horse trolley. They had tracks running all the way up to the island in Pennacook, and as far south as it's currently by McKee Square. There's used to be Memorial Hospital. I don't think anyone would know it by that name, but it's now the Real Estate Commission. So that's the old hospital. And it became Morrill School in later years, and it became a shop class location for the high school students. So the trolley ran that gambit, and it was amazing. But the interesting thing is, the horse trolley, the owners of the horse trolley, they're the ones that inspired that park up there. They didn't want people to leave Concord and go up to the mountains during the summer. They wanted people from the big cities, New York and Boston, to get on the stage and come up here to Concord and to enjoy the beauty of our community. And that park up there, over 20 acres, was established by the people that owned the horse trolley. And then they extended the tracks up, and they brought people there. It was quite an area to visit. It was just quite fascinating. It really was. So, moving along here a little bit, that story I told you about St. Peter's. So I'm looking out the window. I keep going back to that, and there's a reason why I do. When I started doing things at the state hospital, I took some classes on gravestone preservation. And one of the groups I got involved with early on, one of the first groups I got involved with when I was still with the big company, was the Friends of the Old North Cemetery. Frida Spiro actually was in my group right back here. And we offered some classes, and I took some preservation classes and learned how to restore the old stones, because they were neglected, and we always felt bad about that. We did the best we could. So about 6 years ago, I'm over there by myself. I can remember it like it was yesterday. It was an overcast day, slight fog. I'm walking up through the cemetery, and I'm just staring back at St. Peter's School, where I went to school, and I'm looking up at the two windows. And I'm looking back, and I'm thinking back, 40 some odd years ago, 50 years ago, and I'm thinking, I used to look out at the cemetery, and I'm looking back at it. That building is now the New Hampshire Blind Association building. It's on Walker Street and Bradley Street. So I'm looking back, and I'm standing at a good vantage point, the area where I always used to take a look all the time. And I look down at my feet, because I'm looking for broken stones, because I want to preserve some more stones. And I'm standing there, and something catches my eye in the ground. A little white marble. And I'm looking at it, well, I wonder what that is. So I went over my boot, and I kicked it, and it was a stone. I said, that's interesting. That's really too bad. Common for these stones to break off at ground level over the last 200 years, and they'd fall over. Winter would come, spring would come, the foliage, they get covered up, and before you know it, you have sod on top of it and grass growing, and that stone is long lost. You never find it again. But this little glitter caught my eye, and I said, I'll have to, look at that. The historian in me, I said, that's pretty cool. So I went over there, took my boot, I kicked it off, and pulled the grass back, and started working on it a little bit. I picked it up. It was upside down, so it was all smooth. I flipped it over. I couldn't believe it. It said Spain on it. So I read it, and it said William Spain. My middle name's William. I said, wow. The Irish had a common theme where they would name siblings after the other siblings. It's very common. So I went over to Jill's office and got the records for that spot, and sure enough, I was standing over my great-great-uncle Michael Spain's gravestone. The stone that I had looked out and over almost 50 years before from that upstairs window at St. Peter's School. And I was staring at that spot. And that stone probably was buried for 50 years. Who knows? And what are the chances of me being over there on this day, this overcast, foggy day, and looking down, just catching this glimmer? So I picked the stone up, I brushed it off. I called the gentleman that, he actually volunteered to do it for free. He was so moved by the story. He came up from Manchester. He does a lot of work on gravestones down there. He cleaned it, he preserved it, and he erected it. He used some kind of a synthetic cement adhesive to preserve it. And now I go there every Memorial Day and I put one geranium on that nice white marble stone to honor my great-great-uncle, Michael Spain. So it's amazing how things go full circle. And that's what history's all about. Things that happen to you today might or might not have happened if you'd known the history of it. And that applies to everything. It applies to good things and bad things and happy things, sad things. But if we learn from our past, sometimes our future is brighter. So that's the theme that I try to bring forward with Vintage Views. It's interesting. But that story for me was amazing. And since that time, I've also done a ton of research. And I continue to research, non-stop all the time. I'll never run out of stories because there's so many stories to be told. I ended up going to the Old North Cemetery time and time again to see my great-great-uncle and his wife, Catherine. And their son, William, was 1 year old when he died. William Spain died. So what they did is, their little baby died, they buried the baby, and they continued on with their life, but they got him a little stone. When they died, they were buried there too, but their names weren't on that stone. So it's quite a fascinating history when you actually look back, and I'm sure many of you would have stories and can relate to this too, because strange things do happen when you start researching and dealing with these situations. I got close with NAMI, the National Alliance for Mental Illness, people over there. I work with the state hospital, and we had some wonderful, the director's a wonderful man, and we had people participating on the committee. And I learned more sad stories, about mental health and illness and things that happen to people. I started reading, I was reading one night, late at night, about midnight. It was about some of the people with mental health issues that committed suicide. very sad. It's recognized today, and we link it to post-traumatic stress and so on and so forth. But people came back from the Civil War. They had post-traumatic stress syndrome. And what did they do? They put them in the New Hampshire hospital because they didn't understand it. They didn't know what to do. Well, I read about the suicides and the link to the post-traumatic stress syndrome, but I was reading about it more in the period of Civil War veterans. And it just tore me apart. I mean, later now I'm reading about suicide 100 some odd years ago. And because suicide was a sin, they would take those people and not bury them in hallowed ground. Some of the cemeteries would say, we're going to put them in the northwest corner of the cemetery, so they'll be the last to see the sunrise. But what was very common during that period that I read about was they would, more often than not, take the people that did commit suicide, they'd take them to a crossroads in a primitive area, and they'd bury them at a crossroads. No stone, no prayer, no respect. And it really tore at my heart to experience, just reading about it was so difficult. So in history you read about good things and you read about bad things and you make connections to the past like I did with my great-great uncle. And there's a lot of stories to be told. It's quite fascinating. I did bring along one of my stories that I'll read to you. I like just telling stories. I don't like to read in front of people, but I'm going to try this. This is an interesting story. This is the true meaning of Concord. I wrote this, I think I wrote it last fall. We live in Concord. Okay, I've always known this as Concord. But before it was Concord, it had other names too. And it was Rumford prior to being Concord. And prior to being Rumford, it was known as Pennycook. And that's when the original settlers arrived. Picture the Native Americans here. And those Native Americans, this was their land, they owned it. They'd been here for many generations. And you see the first settlers coming up the Merrimack River in canoes, explorers, and they're looking. These gentlemen were part of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and we can debate that type of thing all day long. There's no right answer or wrong answer, but there was a lot of activity during the colonial period up here. There was timber, there was farmland, there's a lot of money to be made. So this story deals with Rumford. When we were set up as Rumford, we actually got into a big debate with Massachusetts because we were part of Massachusetts Bay Colony, and we're Yankees and we don't take lip from anybody. Not to mention there's a lot of Irishmen that were around too. And being Irish, they'll argue about anything anyway. So I'm going to read this quickly to you. True meaning of Concord story. It was in the year 1725 that our beloved town was granted by the Massachusetts Bay Colony as the town of Concord Plantation. The good citizens were subjects of the crown and settled as they established themselves in the first years. There were chores at hand and buildings to be built, while farms were established and a day of worship was observed. Our ancestors certainly knew the value of hard work, and survival was of the utmost concern. They lived their lives as most people of the era did, with a deep appreciation for the little things that provided for them and their growing families. As the decades arrived, there was much talk about the location of our town. The citizens felt that they should not be paying taxes to Massachusetts Bay Colony, nor should they be governed as their neighbors are governed in Massachusetts. So in 1733, the Pennycook Plantation was incorporated as Rumford by the Massachusetts Bay Colony. It was in 1741 that it was determined Rumford was not actually within the jurisdiction of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. It was actually located in the province of New Hampshire. Now, that's kind of associated more with what was going on out around Portsmouth, okay? The province of New Hampshire, separate from the Massachusetts Bay Colony. So, around that period of time, 1741, when this determination was made, There was bitter litigation for many years. That's when it started, in 1741. Our ancestors finally prevailed when this dispute was settled in 1762. Now that's 21 years later. And you know where it was settled? In England, because we were all subjects of the crown. This is before George Washington came along and everything, folks, so it's very interesting. They went to England in 1762, and there was a Privy Council. A Privy Council is like court in England. And I can picture the gentlemen with their white powdered wigs and their fancy clothes and formal attire and their methods and how they functioned. And they listened to the case from the people that lived right here in Concord. And these people in Concord argued their case, and guess what? They won. England decided that it was, in fact, actually located in the province of New Hampshire. So there's been litigation for years, but our ancestors, they finally prevailed, as I said, in 1762. It was with joy in their hearts that our ancestors felt there was a need to change the name of our town from Rumford. Once again, to show that there were no bitter feelings between us and Massachusetts. So 3 years after the Privy Council in England determined Rumford was in fact located in the province of New Hampshire, that Rumford officially reincorporated. This is the land we're standing on right now. They changed the name to Concord, and that was in 1765. 1765, think about that. We're having a lot of problems with taxes, aren't we? We're not liking those people from England. They're taxing tea, they're taxing textile, they're taxing everything. So we're heading towards a Revolutionary War, and the people of Concord are very upset with the British rule, as well as the heavy taxation. So our New Hampshire men fought gallantly and made our state very proud as they fought alongside the men from Massachusetts. As the war concluded and victory was celebrated, our community continued to prosper and grow, and new buildings were added and the population grew after the war. It was on June 23rd, 1785, that our Main Street was at last formally discussed and a final plan for Main Street Concord was put together. The original plan called for Main Street to be 10 rods wide, which is 165 feet. And there's much discussion with these early citizens of Concord. And there's a compromise. And the politicians got involved. And all the people. So this went on and on and on. All this discussion about planning out our Main Street for Concord. They decided that they'll make it 6 rods wide, which is 100 feet, which is as it sits today. So when you drive down Main Street next time in Concord, it should have been originally twice as wide. Wouldn't that have been nice? With a gazebo and some plantings and all that space. It would have been beautiful. But that's what happened there. So Concord was destined to have one of the grandest main streets in the country, and that didn't happen, but it's still a nice main street. We do like it. So it was back in 1765 that our ancestors did rename our town to Concord. And as I mentioned, there was a deep concern to remain close without discourse with our neighbors in Massachusetts. It was with this thought in mind that the name Concord was chosen. For you see, the definition of the word Concord, some of you might know this, is, and I quote, agreement or harmony between people or groups. That's what the word Concord means. With the incorporation of Concord, we offered our friends of the South peace with a desire for harmony and a strong foundation to support one another as we marched into battle, fighting for our independence from England. It's a little story about Concord, and that's why we live in Concord, New Hampshire. So these are the kinds of stories I tell in my vintage views. A learning experience certainly makes for interesting conversation if you're at a cocktail party. But if you listen and you learn from these things, it's fascinating. It's really fascinating. And there is such a bad feeling between Massachusetts and New Hampshire that they changed the name of the town to Concord, just to create that harmony. I thought that was a wonderful thing. I'm going to read one of my poems. I get a little bit crazy with my poems. Love poetry. I should just do poetry instead of vintage views, but I have to do both. Because I started doing the other first. And certainly if you were a poet, you'd be a starving artist and you wouldn't make a living. So, back during the days of Robert Frost, not too long ago, those guys were just superstars in the community, poets. We didn't have Facebook, we didn't have computers. We had books, but we didn't have television. So those people would read poetry. And that's how they passed the time in the evenings and at night. And poetry was wildly popular for hundreds of years. And I won't go quoting the experts and the great ones in the past, but Frost is a favorite of mine. Robert Frost actually has inspired me in a lot of my poetry. I have many of his books. And he was a local guy up here in New Hampshire, Massachusetts. He traveled around this area. So what I started doing is, over the years, I wrote hundreds of poems. Up until a year ago, I didn't publish one of my poems. So I started my poetry, sharing my poetry online. And what ended up happening is, my friends at the Concord Monitor agreed recently to start putting one into the weekly newspaper that they do. It's called the Concord Insider. I'm sure you get that. Yeah. It's free, so pick it up. So each week now I've got a poem featured in the Concord Insider. And I'll just read you a quick one that I wrote. I love the greatest generation. I love World War I, that history in particular. As a child, my grandfather, sadly, was in World War I. He's also in World War II as an older gentleman. And that was not uncommon. And he told me stories as a young boy of serving in the trenches in France. And he certainly, I know he sugarcoated it, but I could see the frustration, the anger, the tears in his eyes. Something he really didn't normally talk about, but he shared some stories with me about that, and it just left a lasting impression on me. So I became I had quite the interest in World War I during that period, history. So I wrote this poem recently, and it was in the Concord Insider, and I'll read it to you. It was just, I think I did it around Christmas time. And the poem is called A Simple Letter. And with these poems that I write, I always match them with an appropriate picture. And some of the pictures I have, and I do take some pictures around town. I'm not a photographer by any means. But I get a lot of my pictures from the Library of Congress, and I always give credit to them. So I found this picture of this little girl back during that period of World War I. And she was in Victorian garb. She's putting a letter in a mailbox all by herself. And I put that in the paper. And here's the poem I wrote called A Simple Letter. The little girl had a letter, her thoughts written most sincere. She paid her postage this late fall day in search of a mailbox near. Her letter was very special. She spent writing each moment she had. This letter contained so much more than words, for it was written to her dad. It was the late fall 1917. Her letter was destined for the war overseas. Christmas was coming very soon. She asked him to come home, please. The pain of loneliness, known by this little girl for years, she deeply missed her daddy dearly, fell asleep each night with tears. Perhaps he would visit her this Christmas, her only gift. She did not want more. She prayed for all the other children too. Lord, please end this war. And that was a sincere poem, again, inspired by World War I, the Great War. But that's what I do. I do the stories, I do the poetry. It's a good mix. I certainly am not selling any books today because I haven't written any books. I volunteer in the community. I figured that you folks today would enjoy a little bit of time and questions and answers too. If anyone had any comments or questions, I'd be happy to hear your stories right now if you'd like to kind of interact. Does anyone have anything to say? At least one person. How about you, Fred?
I had a lot of people from Haverwood that came up the river mounted here. That was my first place. I didn't come there.
Yeah, you're right, Fred. Fred, by the way, is a fellow Rotarian with me. He's my Rotary Club, so I've known Fred for years. Basically, the Merrimack River is a fascinating river. During the time of the Native American lives that were here, they ended up harvesting lots of salmon out of the Merrimack River. This salmon that they harvested, they would take it up the hill to a place called Indian Dell. Indian Dell is where the duck pond is at Blossom Hill Cemetery. Hence, during the WPA, during the Depression, when work was being done at the cemetery, they were putting a water line in, they found Indian remains there. So, very, very rich history of activity with the Indians in Concord. And I bring this up because they were the first people to use the waterways from Haverhill up for transportation and for food and water to drink. So where you found this water, you found life, and it supported their life. A few years after the settlers arrived here in Concord and Rumford, they had this idea to utilize steamboats. And people started thinking, it takes days to get up here on a stagecoach if you're way down south on the Concord coach built by Abbott Downing. So what they did is they had primitive steamboats, and that they progressively got better as the years passed, but they had side wheel steamboats. A gentleman established a series of locks, and I can't recall his name, but he established a series of locks and dams and everything. So there was a period in the 1800s, we had nothing but canoes, and then of course after that transportation went from the canoes and the Indians and the settlers, and then it went to the stagecoach, the Concord coach, very, very famous, you all know about that. There was a period though between the railroad and the stagecoach where they were using the steamships. And the steamships came right into Concord. And there was a Concord Steamboat Company, actually. And they would stop down by the ocean, down in Haverhill, and they would come right up through. And these locks would be, you'd take the steamboat in, they would flood it, bring it up to the next level, and they would keep going. And they came up to Concord. And I actually wrote a story last summer about the steamship company in Concord. There's a nice gentleman that controlled it, he managed it, I believe he was a local attorney. And he had a good heart. What he ended up doing is, he ended up one day bringing one of the first steamships into Concord, right down on the banks of the Merrimack River. And he turned around, blew the steam whistle, the kids came running all around. Of course, the kids had never seen a steamship or heard a steam whistle, so it was quite startling. So he just got down there on the gangplank, and he said to everybody, "Come on aboard, I'm going to give you a ride in your first steamboat." And he brought the kids out, up and down the Merrimack River. You couldn't go too far north because of the terrain, but you could get up towards Sewell's Falls, up that way. And then he came back down. But that was quite a story. I had written that story, like I said, I think it was last summer. But what a wonderful story, helping people. That's one of my favorite stories. I talk a lot about Mary Baker Eddy. She used to go out to Clinton Street where we had the Concord State Fair. Biggest fair around. People came from all over. And the Concord State Fair was the very first place in our region that launched a hot air balloon. I wrote a story about that. Really, really interesting story. And I have, believe it or not, a picture of that ascension, the hot air balloon. It's pretty interesting. But it was so popular, that state fair, where they launched that balloon, with people on it. It was so popular that the horse trolley actually had tracks around Clinton Street to bring people from Main Street out to Clinton Street to attend that fair. So it was very interesting, very interesting. And again, there's so much history here. It's just a wonderful, wonderful thing. I've been talking a lot. Does anyone have any comments or want to say anything or throw me out or anything? Sue?
I have a microphone.
Yeah, if anyone wants to say anything. I would love to hear, you know, when I come into a room and there's individuals that are retired, I see loving people. You obviously love history, but boy, the stories in this room, it's amazing. It fill volumes.
I was picking up on the name Rumford.
Yes.
Was there a Count Rumford?
Absolutely.
And a Rumford stove?
Absolutely.
Okay, tell us about him.
Yeah, I could go on for hours about him. He was a gentleman that came to Concord, and I think his name was Benjamin Thomas, and he married locally here, a prominent family, and did very well for himself. He came as a young man, he's a school teacher at Concord. But the reference you make is, he's a very intelligent individual. He invented a lot of things, and he held a lot of patents. And the Rumford fireplace that you referred to,
Yeah.
stove, fireplace, basically in colonial Concord, or Rumford at that time, you had your houses being built with brick. The brick was made from clay from the riverbed. You turned around and built these fireplaces like boxes. They went straight up the back. Well, this gentleman, who was bestowed the honor of being called Count, but that was overseas, and that's another story. All right, happy here all afternoon. But he ended up coming up with the idea that if you curve the back of that fireplace, it would radiate the heat out into the room. So that's a good point, and that's what he did. And that became the common fireplace, the Rumford fireplace. Not just here, but across the country. More questions? Who's got that microphone?
Was it because of him that the town was named Rumford? Or not?
Not really, but interesting stories.
You mentioned preserving old buildings, and it brings to mind the railroad station that was in Concord.
Mhm.
And I grew up in a city in Massachusetts that had one, was practically the same architecture,
Mhm.
also destroyed
Yeah.
in the name of progress. I wonder if you have any stories about that building being
Well,
torn down.
I do. You know, it's interesting you bring that up because I'm actually a little bit involved right now through the Heritage Commission. I don't want to speak out of shop here, but some funds were budgeted to honor that station. We call it the train depot, but in fact on that piece of land, it's right where Burlington Coat Factory Outlet is. That was known as Railroad Square. And there was no store street. It was just flat land. And what it had there is you had the river on the far side, and then on the flat land there at the lower level below Main Street, you had a depot. Well, there's been 3 on that spot. 3 actually. The first one, all they did was accept Concord coaches. But as time progressed and the coach went away, the railroad took over and became the train depot. I've written a lot about the train depot, and I like to refer to the train depot as the port that launched 1,000 sailors. Somewhat of a romantic statement, but I mean that affectionately, but sadly too, because all of these young men, dating back to the Civil War too, but more likely World War I, World War II, my family was going to serve. They would go down to the train depot, and that was where they departed for basic training in World War I and World War II. The sad thing is that many of those people that departed never returned to Concord, and they were lost, and their families never saw them. So the last image captured is just a wave of a train window, and that was it. So it's sad. The building was grand. The last train depot was grand. There were some funds appropriated by the city of Concord. There was a grant. And if you're out walking around this summer during the warmer weather, there's going to be a monument placed. Liz Hengen actually designed it with the city designer. There's a lot of people, I don't want to mention all the names because I would miss somebody. A lot of good people came up with this design. And this design shows transportation. And it has a picture of the original depot inside and out. It's absolutely beautiful. If you go down Main Street, you go down the street that swoops down, I can't remember exactly which one, but standing where this big plaque's going to be placed, you're actually standing almost at the entrance to the old train depot. And if you get a chance this summer to get out and look at that, it'd be a good experience for you. I donated 1 picture. The picture I donated for that plaque is of my uncle, John Spain, and Frank Spain, Francis Spain. They parted together, and I got that picture just recently. It's near and dear to me. It's owned by the widow of Frank Spain, and her name is Sylvia King. She lives locally here. Sylvia, I believe, is 97 now. She was married to my dad's first cousin, Frank. Used to call him Blizz. That's a story about a blizzard, and I won't go into that. But anyway, long story short, I donated that picture, and I was just so honored that they are going to put that on there. But the sad thing is that, as I said, arrivals and departures. Arrivals are a joy, but departures are really bittersweet. My Uncle John came back. He spent 30 years in the Army, but unfortunately, Frank did not return. He died during World War II. But boy, what a beautiful picture. Two smiling young lasses, probably 17, leaving Concord. One of them to return and one of them never to return. So kind of a bittersweet story. We have another question up here? Fred.
Yes, the Leaning Tower of Concord. A lot of these people are not from the Concord area. They wonder why that building is leaning.
Are you referring to the gas house, Fred?
Yes, I am.
Okay. That's another, it's on the National Register now. Being a historian, I follow this closely. We did have a presentation at the City of Concord over a year ago by Liberty Utilities, and they seem sincere. They now own the building. We're deeply concerned because every time you go by, you see a new hole in the roof or a tree poking through or something. That building is a fascinating building. I mean, just to look at it. I was told at one point it was one of two remaining in the country. And what that building was created for, to make gas, for the early gas use, the gas lanterns on Main Street, gas used in houses before electricity. So what ended up happening is they would burn coal. And that building has a big subterranean level with a bladder system. And they'd burn the coal, and it would create gas. And the bladder would rise with the heat and the gas, and that would keep the pressure. So then you had the gas pressurized. And that's why that building was created. It's a very simple design, and it's very primitive, but it's really, really historic. So we hope and pray that it is preserved. And good point, Fred, to bring it up, because I worry about that building too. The tower's been leaning on the top now for at least more than a decade. I hope it's stable, but Liberty has done a lot of work to shore up that property and preserve it on the inside, things you can't see. So there is an effort, there's a desire, and I have not met one person with the City of Concord or without the City of Concord that wants to see that come down. So we're all on the same page. Another question?
Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, you mentioned that your grandfather owned some of the old quarries.
Yep.
Were they the ones by any chance up behind Blossom Hill, up behind the cemetery?
Absolutely.
Our hiking group was up there recently.
Oh.
We would be very interested in hearing
Sure.
you tell a little bit about them sometime, if we could arrange that.
When I was a young child, I had a mini bike, and my dad had his motorcycle, and we drove from our house by White's Park up there. Of course, Dad was a state trooper. I didn't know I had to have a license. He said, "Follow me, Jim." So I did. And we drove up there, and we went up behind the cemetery, where you reference. There's a gravel road, and that road was used to haul the granite down the hill. And the workers would use it to go to work each morning. So when you go up that hill, one of the first quarries on that road that you encounter is Perry's Quarry, owned by Perry Brothers. Left-hand side, people have been swimming there for years, and I did, and I think probably a lot of people in this room did too. So if you go past that, though, there's another quarry just up the road, a short distance. You go under the power lines, and we used to have different names for that, but some people called it Fish Quarry or Cat and Dog, but it's another quarry. It's a smaller one. Between those two quarries, so after you go by Perry's Quarry, and you continue up that road, there's, where the power lines start, you'll see that the ground is all disturbed. It's been mined. That was my great-grandfather, Martin Spain's quarry. That was Spain Quarry. Now, my father brought me there. Now, you got to remember, I was 12 years old. That was a long time ago. Dad brought me up there, and I looked at it, and, you know, I didn't know. I said, "Really, Dad? Come on." I thought that was pretty cool. It's a great story for your dad to tell you. And I thought it might have been part of a lore, that maybe my grandfather would be in Amarillo, told my dad told me. So I didn't think much about that. And then with my writing the past years and my research, you're not going to believe this, I found a book. And it's called The Successful Businessmen of Concord, New Hampshire. I said, "Oh, that's kind of interesting, kind of like a directory with businesses." like a city directory, but it was nice write-ups. And it was really old. It was like 1900. So I said, that's interesting. Let me go to the S's, and let's see if there's any Spain in there. Well, I had forgotten about the story that Dad told me. I popped that book open. Martin Spain. No finer grin in his mind on Rattlesnake Hill than from the quarry of Martin Spain. And there's my great-grandfather talking to me. Kind of cool.
So when were they working there?
1890s,
Really?
1900. Some of the quarries date back prior to that. There's a lot of old stories. A lot of old stories. I could do a whole book on just the granite quarries. Amazing stories.
Not today, though.
Not today, Sue. Any other questions?
Questions anymore?
Or comments?
Comments?
Because it's about 3:15, but I've got a couple minutes. I don't know if Sue will give us a couple minutes, and anybody wants to make a comment, I'm certainly here. You'll be on TV, folks. Come on. You can watch yourself on Channel 22.
Okay, here we go. We have someone that's calling for the microphone.
Well, we're a friendly group, so we appreciate that. Thank you.
Paul. This is the last
Hi,
one.
Paul. Last one?
Yeah.
Okay.
I was born and brought up in Chester, New Hampshire, and the Chester Turnpike always fascinated me. And
Got a little closer to your mouth. There.
I didn't learn till this year that the early people in Concord petitioned somebody to have that road built from Chester to Concord to get people from Haverhill up here to settle it.
Interesting.
And of course, you can still see it today in Allenstown.
Yes.
And then from there, I assume it's Route 3,
Yeah.
which is Manchester Street.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And they must have had a ferry or something there at the river.
Mm-hmm.
Also, right there is the old Turnpike Road that goes up to Airport Road. Now, I'm wondering if stage came from Portsmouth and came down that road to join that one to get into town.
Good point, and we will conclude, but interesting about transportation, of course, the first New Hampshire Turnpike was basically Route 4. It's been rerouted, but from Portsmouth, you're absolutely right, to Concord. And along the way there were inns, and there's a lot of history, and there's a lot of monuments scattered about, and the road did change a little bit over the years. I know that when you talk about bridges and ferries and that sort of stuff, right here in Concord, the first settlers, you have the Merrimack River dividing the heights where we are today. This was called the Dark Plains, and other names too, but this was the Dark Plains. A lot of pines up here, a lot of sand. They also called it Burglar's Island. The main population, the original settlers in Concord that arrived on those roads that you talk about, settled on the west side of the Merrimack River. That's where the population was centered. But there were some people living on this side of the river too. The interesting thing about the Heights is there's so much history here. I could go on and on again, Sue, but I'm not going to. But there's so much history here. But when the first settlers arrived, and you had the Merrimack River, they built a bridge, and they charged a toll. And there was a series of bridges. And these bridges are down kind of where the bridge is today, where Bridge Street is, that area. And there's a series of bridges. And a freshet more than once came down the river, all the ice, and knocked these wooden bridges down. So what they did is they kept building them again. So during the colonial period, going back to the 1700s, there was actually a bridge, and it was a toll bridge, and you paid so much money to cross it. Well, the first church was on the site, it burned down, but it's on the site of the Walker School, Binney Media, over there by the Old North Cemetery. So the pastor was getting upset because people weren't going to church on Sunday. And the pastor said, what am I going to do about this? The pastor went to the mayor and said, I'm talking to people in my congregation. I'm asking why people aren't coming from the Heights going to church. The Dark Plain, Burglar's Island. Why aren't those people attending Mass at my church? And people said, because we can't afford to pay the toll. So the pastor went to the city, Romford, and he said, listen, could you just make it free on Sunday to support my parish, my congregation? So that's what they did. And guess what happened? It was free on Sunday. people said, this is great. Why do I have to pay Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday then? So people started saying, this is crazy. I'm not paying you a toll during the week. I get free passage on Sunday if I go to church. So they ended up, the city of Concord, Rumford, actually paid the gentleman that owned the bridge. And from that time forward, the toll bridge in Concord that was on Bridge Street, the old wooden structure, was known as Free Bridge. And that's how it got its name. So just a little interesting history about bridges and transportation. And you're absolutely right, the roads, they're everywhere. So it's fascinating. So thank you so much, folks. I had a wonderful time. I appreciate it. You're all,
Thank you, Jim, for coming.
thank you, Sue. I appreciate it. And I'll be glad to come back again next year. I hope you continue to read the newspaper and enjoy it. And if I say something out of place, you want to write a letter to the editor, that's cool too. Take care, folks. A pleasure. Bye.